Okay, I'm going to talk about corporate greed a little bit. So, a lot of progressives they like to blame corporate greed for pretty much all the world's problems, right? And it kind of checks out because if there is a ruling class who's exploiting labor, and that exploitation is causing poverty, then the poverty causes the problems, right? The poverty causes the whether it's hunger or I don't know, poor health outcomes or crime and violence. Poverty does lead to problems, right? And so therefore, you could say that corporate greed is probably causing a lot of the problems. But I don't like the term corporate greed, and instead I prefer to use the term corporate fear. Now, why corporate fear? What's the distinction between fear and greed? Well, there the thing is it's fear that causes the greed, right? So when you have, like, say for example, you have a middle class citizen, and they are, they're middle class, right? They can afford necessities. They can afford their health care and their shelter. They can afford, I don't know, a vehicle or whatever. Maybe they don't have vacation homes, but and luxury cars, but they have the necessities, right? And they can afford a little bit beyond the necessities. They can afford some comforts. So what happens when you give this middle class citizen $1 million a year job? Well, they're probably going to increase their standard of living, right? They're probably going to start spending more money, and before long, they might have a few vacation houses. They might have some luxury cars. They might get better health care, for example. The point here is that when you give the middle class citizen, when you give them money, they're probably going to start behaving more greedily, right? They're going to become more greedy. Now, why is that? I'm not saying everyone will do this, but 9 out of 10 people, if you give them more money, they're going to justify keeping that money for themselves rather than, for example, donating $950,000 of that salary and living on their previous salary, right? So why is this? Why do people why do people justify their greed? Well, again, it's because of fear, right? And that's kind of the point of calling it corporate fear rather than corporate greed. People fear poverty. They fear the woes of poverty. They fear being homeless. They fear not being able to afford health care or necessities, right? They fear uh, they fear becoming desperate and having to turn to violence to make a living, right? So they're going to justify their greed to avoid the woes of poverty. And I think this goes for, again, most people. It takes a really dignified person to start making that $1 million a year salary and actually donate the money they don't need to charity, right? Everyone's going to continually justify, I don't know, buying assets or maybe having a giant savings account. People are going to protect themselves, right? And that's why there's really not a difference between the middle class citizen and the ruling class citizen. The ruling class citizen was just more often born into wealth, right? But they still look at the poverty in the same way, and they fear the woes of poverty, just like the middle class citizen does, and the lower class citizen. If you give a lower class citizen a bunch of money, what are they going to do? Maybe some people will invest in, I don't know, invest in kind of bringing up the communities they were born from. An example of that, a good example, is LeBron James, right? He has made tons of investments into Akron, Ohio in particular, and it's because that's where he comes from. He has empathy for where he came from and the people who are still struggling in that situation, right? So that's kind of the point here, is that you can either have empathy and you can help the people who still need it, or you can allow fear to control your behaviors, and you can allow fear to justify greed. This is kind of it's kind of human nature, right? We like to say that human nature is greed, but we have examples of human nature being empathetic, right? Where these wealthy people do help the people who, they help the communities they came from. This is the difference between a society that it has rising wealth inequality and rising crime, rising violence, rising division, and a society that works together to fix their problems. It's the difference between fear and empathy. So again, if you, let's say you're a wealthy person, right? And you see the poverty and you continually justify the collection of excess because you fear poverty. Well, what does that collection of excess do? It creates more scarcity. It creates more poverty. The poverty creates more crime, violence, homelessness, and that creates more fear, and it further justifies more greed. It's circular logic, right? And the thing is even if you are a wealthy person, the woes of poverty, you're not insulated from them completely. Money can kind of insulate you from them, but every now and then that rich kid, he becomes a heroin addict, or he falls in with the wrong people and ends up in a gang, right? That's the thing. It's like the more you justify greed, the more poverty you create, and that poverty is going to probably bite you in the ass sooner or later. Whether it's your child becoming a heroin addict, or whether it's a civil war, right, or a revolution of sorts. The point here is that you really need to look at your behaviors and determine whether you are collecting excess because you need it or because you fear poverty. You fear what may come if you don't have excess. Because the more excess you collect, the more scarcity you're creating. And again, more scarcity, more poverty, more fear. And if you keep this vicious cycle going, it's just going to lead to more of the same. It's going to lead to more wealth inequality, more crime, more violence, and more fear. We have to understand that our emotions, they kind of underlie all of the decisions we make. And if we become so fearful that we justify greed because of that fear, then we never take the empathetic steps to solve the problem, to solve the poverty. So if you have, if you have money sitting in stocks, or sitting in a bank account, or sitting in assets that aren't being used, the money in the stocks is being used, right? But it's most likely just paying executives. It's most likely just paying stockholders who can afford to invest, rather than the people who actually need the money, who are most likely the laborers who are being exploited, whose labor is being exploited, right? The bottom line is that you can't allow fear to justify greed, excess greed, right? Now, maybe you have a small savings account for a rainy day, but at what point do you need 3 houses? Do you need 2 cars? Do you need, I don't know, do you need the newest cell phone that comes out every year? The answer to those questions is no. And I'm not saying I'm perfect either. That's not the point here. There's a house right behind me here, right? I'm not saying that you can't have a house, but do you need, I don't know. You just have to ask yourself, what do you need, and are you justifying those supposed needs because of your fear of scarcity? And if you are, then you're creating more scarcity, and you're effectively creating more fear. And that's the thing. We don't like fear. Nobody likes fear. But if we feed into the fear without realizing it, because we're not aware of the underlying catalyst of our behaviors, then we're gonna end up with more fear. And again, everyone wants to get rid of their fear, but some people are in a position to help more than others, and those are the people with excess. So think about not even just the things you own, but the things you buy every day. Are you buying necessities, or are you buying material goods that ultimately allow some corporation to profit? The thing is when you use the term corporate greed, you're blaming corporations, right? You're blaming people, greedy people, rich people, for the problem. But they're just humans, like every lower class citizen is. They're just people succumbing to their fear. That's it. And when you make them evil, they're not evil. They're just fearful. And fear is not something that should be shamed. Fear is a natural emotion. And if you're born into a world and you're indoctrinated to allow fear to control you, then again, there's no shame in that. It's just, you're kind of a victim, right? Now, it's not to say to victimize yourself. You have to realize you've been a victim of this indoctrination of these fearful lifestyles, and learn to control it and learn to become more empathetic. Now, I'm not trying to pretend I'm some psychologist or whatever, but that's the truth of the human condition. The human condition is fundamentally emotional, and if you allow fear to win out over empathy, the world's not going to be a fun place to live in. And we know that, right? That checks out. It makes perfect sense, you know. And the truth is most of the poor people in the United States, they don't have it so bad compared to a lot of the poor people in some African nations, right? If you can eat, I mean, you have it a lot better than a lot of people out there. So if you're a middle class citizen, it's safe to say you have a lot of excess. So don't wait around for the ruling class to give up their wealth. Okay, you have to realize there's people that have it a lot worse than you, and or a lot worse off than you are, and you can help them more than you may give yourself credit for. So thanks for watching.